Very good. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session, which promises to be extremely interesting for everyone, myself included, who's been following the development and the progress of the casino legislation into Japan and the potential development of what could be the world's second biggest casino market, according to some. We're on the brink of what if you read certain overexcited media organisations, is going to be a complete transformation of the areas where these integrated resorts eventually get put, whether those are in Osaka, Nagasaki, or the other places that have been mentioned as potential locations for those. And we're joined today by David Bonnet, who's a gaming analyst, gaming industry analyst, and has been an advisor to the industry in some various capacities, and I think has a great deal to say with a presentation which we'll start with and then take questions afterwards. Could everyone please put their phones onto manner mode, and we'll get started right away with the presentation. David, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Leo, for those nice opening, nice introduction. I'll just give a quick few opening remarks. I think right now, we're on the eve of the Japanese government preparing to pass this integrated resort legislation. And for as long as I've been covering gaming in Asia, which has been, I think, more than 10, maybe close to 15 years, this has been something that the Japanese government has been talked about and has gone through a lot of different kind of iterations. But while it's taken a long time to get to this point, I think you have to give the Japanese government some credit in kind of responding to the economic realities and putting forth a new industry that has a chance to really do some good in terms of helping to grow GDP, and really to kind of creating a new industry which will provide jobs and economic growth primarily for the Japanese people. So without further ado, I've tried to find the most interesting title I could, called Economic Overview. Obviously, I understand we may want to ask some questions that are slightly not on this topic, but one of the reasons I do that is because, and I was telling Leo earlier, I come from primarily a finance background, finance and economics, and so when I develop my opinions, a lot of times they go through a lot of rigorous sensitivity analysis and modeling. So most of the views I've come to have actually, there have been basically an analysis of where things have been, where things stand, and how they may develop. So if you ever want to ask me any numbers questions, we can get to that, but primarily this should stay a little bit more high level. So in any event, I'll talk a little bit more about Macau. It's an industry that's pretty mature. I think if Japan could get anywhere like the numbers that Macau generates, they'd probably be pretty happy. But then I'll just talk a little about really what the IR is and what we are expecting, what kind of regulations, how it compares to other jurisdictions, and some other things. This is supposed to go about 20 to 25 minutes, so I might be a little bit fast. If any of you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. Please don't be afraid to interrupt. So I think we all know about what happened in Japan with this. We're expecting to pass the implementation bill, but in Macau, what's interesting, what's happening is it's almost like Macau's kind of been too aggressive lately in terms of the amount of gaming revenue they've been getting. And this has been happening for a couple of years now, where they're actually trying to crack down on money flows coming out of China. At least you can call them illicit money flows or whatnot. But to a certain extent, the Macau gaming regulator is very sensitive on looking at money flows coming out of China, and that's going to be something that Japan's going to have to think about. How they want to deal with, you could say, the VIP segment and whatnot. But what's really much more important, and what's getting a lot of attention right now, is these Macau gaming licenses. And a lot of people like to call them renewals, but what they in fact are, they're concessions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they've had 20-year concessions. They're about to expire. And I think one of the other things to talk about is just when we think about licenses in general, like the geopolitical factors. Obviously, everyone is probably pretty aware of what's going on in the world right now. So, the implications for different operators coming from different countries and how they get evaluated is something that we at least need to take into consideration. So in Macau, these are some widely known information, but there are 6 major gaming operators, and as you can see, these concessions expire within the next couple of years, and that's kind of interesting because in Macau, what's happened is you've invested billions and billions of dollars into new projects like the Wind Palace and the MGM Cotai and Parisian Macau and amongst others, Studio City. And when you have concessions expiring, the ability to generate a attractive return on your capital with a limited license, investors need to ask questions, and they will ask questions whether or not, how can I make long-term budgeting and capital planning when I have a limited time frame on my known investment time horizon. So these types of things are just the Macau government's pretty practical. I don't expect anything crazy to happen, but it does add an element of risk, and I think it's something that anyone who is making an investment into a casino concession will have to take into consideration. And these are some potential outcomes. I won't go into them every single one, but my sense is that the Macau government, it's kind of like when your rent expires and you have a cheap rent, and all of a sudden your lease expired and the rent goes up. The landlord's going to charge you more money. So I think that's probably going to happen in Macau. Japan IR overview. So really, everyone talks about integrated resorts, but what is it really integrated? And this kind of comes from Las Vegas and New Jersey type of vernacular. But integrated resort really integrates diversified hospitality products on massive scales. And now this has kind of come to represent a casino gaming. And no one really talks about gambling or casinos. They always talk about gaming and entertainment. These are kind of some of the verbiage that casino operators will use. Gambling, it's called gambling addiction. It's not called gaming entertainment addiction. So this is kind of something to keep in mind that, when you win in a casino, you may not necessarily have a responsible gambling problem. It's when you lose that, these things kind of happen. So there's a little bit of these things to be sensitive about. But I think it's important to understand that the IR customers that the casino operators will attract will be responsible gaming entertainment customers. At least that's what they will tell you. And so when we think of IRs, we think of historical places where they're located. Obviously, Las Vegas, New Jersey, Macau, Singapore, but they all have something kind of similar, is that they're close to major financial centers, transportation hubs, and logistics hubs and airports. There's a reason for that, is because you need, when you build these gigantic properties, they need to be centered in areas where they attract a massive population. So, it's something to think about when you're kind of thinking of these locations where you may put them here in Japan. I like to say this, and I'm not sure people agree with me, but I say Japan already has integrated resorts. They just don't integrate casinos yet, and so this is like Tokyo Disney and Universal Studios are massive complexes. If you took one of those ballrooms at any of these places and put in a casino, you would have an integrated resort with gaming. But the point is that Japan already has gaming, and they already have non-gaming integrated resorts. But now you're going to add something you're going to create something that's different, which is like a massive complex that has a lot of non-gaming entertainment, and you're going to add casino gaming into it. And what's interesting about that is no one really knows how that's going to look. But the IR bill does something interesting, is that it creates these regional monopolies where that by kind of not abandoning what you call, let's say, like a Las Vegas strip model or a Macau Cotai strip model, and putting these casinos in disparate locations, you essentially create little monopolies. And anytime you can, in economics, anytime you can create a monopoly, it's generally a good thing. So that's why you see the mass amount of interest from these gaming operators, or even non-gaming operators, to participate in this. Some of the interesting things that are in the IR bill, which you could say are a little bit unconventional, or just, you could say a lot of this stuff having to do with my number and taxation. Most you could say casino patrons, when they go into a casino and play blackjack or baccarat or slot machines, they don't consider every play as like a taxable event. But it seems like the Japan government will look at that as anytime you win or anytime you cash your chips in or you take some money in to buy casino chips, they're going to be able to track that and know that. And that's something it's very hard to kind of understand because it's going to be 7 years down the road, how that's going to affect customer behavior. But we think it causes more friction than not having it. That's for sure. This is kind of some of the timelines. You guys can read these for yourselves, but one of these things is just like 7 years later, at the best case, we think is when you could have a grand opening of an IR. It's going to take a while to form all of these casino control commissions and get your RFPs and choose the locations. But in any event, certainly you have 7 years now to spend a lot of money to prepare these things. So even though you would not necessarily, that Japan might not get immediate tax benefits for 7 years, the planning in order to build these resorts, it takes billions and billions of dollars. So you'll see liberalization in terms of banks being more open to lend, and the liberalization of capital in Japan right now, where it's an environment with negative interest rates and a challenging inflationary environment, to say the least. Here are some of the regulations. I'm happy to provide a copy of this presentation if you guys haven't seen this before. But some of these things I think they've been widely well reported. I think some of the operators will have a lot of questions about these things, but in any event, it's better to have an IR bill than to not have an IR bill. So I do a little bit of Macau comparisons. I'll skip over these and just get to the summary, which is that as the x-axis is basically thousands of square feet, and the right axis is millions of dollars of EBITDA. So as you can see, as you go up in square feet, you generally increase your EBITDA on basically a linear or proportional basis. This is just my old company, Sands China, and this just take from their annual report. So there's nothing here. This is all public information. But that being said, all we're talking about here is that there's a tendency to go big when you go for integrated resorts.
I just want to explain what the different ones are.
Oh, sorry. So the first one would be Sands. It's Sands Macau, which is primarily casino, then Four Seasons. The third one would be a Parisian. The biggest one would be SEC, and that's one of the biggest buildings in the world. And the last one would be Venetian. And SEC is a bit of an outlier there, but generally speaking, you can just look at Sands, and generally the more square footage you have, the bigger your cash flows, EBITDA. This kind of gets back to my days of being an economist and studying economics or whatnot, but when we look at the IR overview, you just basically look in terms of how you generate and give back to the population. I'll just go over the three things. That direct impacts are the direct GDP, and the indirect impacts are those other, you could say, spending by the government and also supply chain effects. And then the indirect impacts are, let's say, those employees that are working there that actually go and then actually spend money at, you could say, food and beverage or just other discretionary spending. You can take a look at these direct, indirect impacts, and you can basically group them and then model out how much you can expect a community where an IR would go to generate. And say, okay, well, if we know that we're going to invest $2 billion here, we understand what the revenue, what the EBITDA is, how many employees we're expecting to have, but we can essentially kind of model that out and figure out, okay, any of these communities should see this amount of economic impact. I won't spend too much time on this. If anyone wants to ask me about it this after, I'm happy to go through it. But all I'm trying to say here is for every $1 billion of casino revenue you can generate, what I'm thinking is that you'll probably get about 130, let's say, to 150 millions of EBITDA. And for every $1 billion of casino revenue, you could expect to have anywhere between, let's say, gaming taxes would be direct off the top, 30%, 300 million. And then you just look at the expenses for those areas, and you could say, well, anywhere between $200 to $400 million, let's say, of actually local economic benefits for that area. And you can look at a place like Macau, where a lot of Macau residents young people who have gone off to college have come back have gotten jobs with the casinos there, and now they're quite successful and moving up in management positions. It's really changed the character of how people think about whether I should go and leave my hometown, whether I should stay, what the economic activity and the sense for a positive future is via working in an integrated resort. Here's my summary. Obviously, the IR operators would have preferred something that was maybe a little bit more less restrictive, but the regional monopolies that are created means that anyone who actually gets an IR license will be able to kind of generate significant value. The regional demand for goods and services will skyrocket based on just procurement and when you operate a big organization or enterprise like this, there's going to require a lot of partners to be involved. Because of the above average market returns, you can expect a lot of non-Japanese companies, real estate companies, trading companies, and other types of companies to try and participate. And finally, I think some of these other things which will remain to be seen, but it's the practical details of anti-money laundering laws. Know your customer, my number, junket licensing, and whatnot will have to all be kind of mediated out and understood. Finally, obviously organized crime, and this is something that needs to be relevantly addressed, and also the good relations between Japan and China. So, the really question people ask me is, well, who do you think is going to receive these 3 licenses, right? And I always like to prioritize, right? The tax payments, right? That's the government's top criteria. Then there's also this, prioritizing responsible gaming, which it seems the government has done. They've put in these laws in order to kind of reduce the ability for the Japanese population to go to the casinos, right? Promoting economic growth in rural areas, that seems to be a major priority. And then there's emphasis on non-gaming attractions, and then mitigation of organized crime. So at the end of the day, what I say is the winner will be the group that promises to build the biggest integrated resort with the smallest casino. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we start with questions, can I just a couple of things that occurred. There have been a number of figures that different analysts have been using. Just as a starting point, what are you using as your underlying thesis for how big the market is going to be in terms of revenues in Japan if you do get 3 IRs? Assuming the 3 operating IRs, and what sort of size market are you talking about? Right, so if you look at just the most recent IRs to be developed, which are in Macau, you're looking at anywhere between, you could say, $1.5 to $2 million a room as a construction cost per room. So, and an integrated resort, it really needs, in order for it to be integrated, it needs to be big, over 500 rooms, probably closer to 1,000. So if you're talking about $1 million a room and 1,000, or $1.5 million a room US and 1,000 rooms, you're looking at immediately $1.5 billion of investment. So in order to generate $1.5 billion of investment and have returns that will justify that, you need to basically have a market that is a couple $2 billion for each of these regional locations. So that's generally how we look at it. You obviously, the market's not there right now, but over time, the casino will make sure that market is developed, and it will attract customers from around Japan, not just that single area, also overseas customers as well. Right. Yeah, so that's the other question, which is who's going to go to these? Well, I mean, that's a good question. Well, there's a segment of the population which are Japanese nationals that will be restricted in their ability to go in terms of, and then there will be a segment of foreigners. And if you just looked on average how foreign-only casinos, like customers who are not residents, you can take examples of Vietnam and take examples of South Korea. It take a lot longer to get off the ground, to get financed, to plan, and then to ultimately build and open. It's just casino integrated resorts need a lot of people in order to function and to operate efficiently. Integrated resort can't operate with a minimum amount of people. So it's going to be imperative that the
casino is allowed to attract foreign customers, primarily, I would think Chinese customers. That's why we had this last point back here of the continued good relations between Japan and China. Is that we hope that the Chinese customers will come and that they'll be allowed to bring their foreign currency in, declare it, and play, and then that would be a significant portion of the customer demographic.
And just lastly, before we open to questions, just going back to the Macau material, is your when you were looking at the restrictions that have been placed and the just behavioural changes that have evolved there, is your thesis that Macau now plateaus at roughly the revenue level that it is at the moment, or does it?
There's a lot of things influencing Macau, and first, VIP revenue is highly volatile, VIP versus the mass segment. The second is RMB depreciation. Will always make the revenue a little bit lower. If the RMB appreciates, it makes it a little bit higher. But you can look at most of Macau being a mature market. Most of the integrated resorts have been developed. So without a lot of new product, it's hard other than for incremental revenue. I would say the one kind of game changer for Macau is there's a massive, one of the world's longest bridges, the Hong Kong-Macau-Zhuhai Bridge, which is truly extraordinary. You'll be able to land at Hong Kong Airport, and within 40 minutes, you'd be riding over into Macau. Right now, there's a semi-regular ferry schedule, and generally the fastest way to get from Hong Kong into Macau is through Central. So you're going the opposite way. So so when you have these infrastructure improvements, that will generally lead to higher population or tourism visitation, and then higher revenues. But no necessarily spike changes that you would see when a new integrated resort opens.
Got it. Brilliant. Right. So questions, if we have any. I'll ponder that for a moment, and then. One of the things that's been happening, certainly in Japan, is you had up there pachinko. The revenues of pachinko have been falling quite steadily for some time now, and that has turned from being an industry where you couldn't fail to make money to one where you've seen closures of pachinko pubs. What are you reading into that? Do you read anything from what's going on in pachinko does anything from what's going on there temper your enthusiasm?
When's the last time you've been to a pachinko hall?
Right, I'm not necessarily the right person to ask for that. But,
So the reason I ask is that's the pachinko is a unique game. It requires a certain skill set. It primarily caters to Japanese males, and you could also say that there's a lot more. Different types of avenues for entertainment these days with video games and other types of multiplayer environments. So. Pachinko will always exist, but the market's saturated for pachinko. It's very difficult to find new customers. Versus integrated resort, the emphasis should be on the non-gaming attractions, and then have this ancillary revenue be generated through customers going and playing in the casino.
And when you were, this is one question, and then we're done. Perfect. And also, going back as well to the who's going to get this, right? Which is that's the question that a lot of us are interested in, and that's for the journalists in this room. I think we've all been approached over the last over the last sort of 18 months really by the big casino operators who are very keen to tell us and to show us artists' impressions of what their resorts will look like, and they've been on a relatively hard sell through the media, but also of course they've been going to Osaka for years now, right? I mean there is going to be quite an interesting battle between them in terms of what they bring to the. How are they going to differentiate themselves? What are they going to use to differentiate themselves between one another?
There are two things you really need to make a successful integrated resort, and that's a casino license, which is required, but also you need the relevant piece of land, a large piece of land, anywhere between 20 to 50 acres. And in Japan, where you have a very feudalistic type of environment for land holdings, that's a very difficult thing to acquire. So I would imagine that as the conversations develop, also we know the Japanese governments, they have at least in my opinion, preference for public-private partnerships or working with established Japanese companies. And so what remains to be seen, and what's interesting is when these big trading companies or these big landholding companies, it's the implementation bill is not the law yet. But once it becomes a law and becomes more clarity on how this actually gets executed, you'll see, I think, a lot more non-traditional Japanese companies starting to put in their opinions, and you'll have a much more interesting discussion versus just a lot of foreign casino operators, expecting that they're gonna that the licensing process will be the same as either Macau or in Singapore.
Sorry, please. And could you just say where you're coming from?
I have a few questions.
Oh, sure. This is a press conference, so please, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member. I have been gambling in my younger days all over the world. I mean, let's say all over the northern hemisphere. I'm from Switzerland. Ultimately, also Switzerland got their casinos. When I was a youngster, we all had to go over to Germany or to France or to Spain ultimately, and so on. So I'm more used to the European style, but I have also been all the way up the Pacific from Singapore to Korea, and Korea is probably the worst example of what can happen with casinos. Anyhow, my first question is, in your presentation, you mentioned that closeness of big accumulations of people is important, which makes quite some sense from an operator's point of view. Of course, you say Los Angeles and Las Vegas. That is still it's a jump by plane to make. In Germany now, according to the latest, I don't have the latest really, but what I know is people within 30 kilometers of the casino are not allowed to play, period. So that prevents them from going in there every night. So Japan has its own regulations. But the difference here is the government makes a big point out of developing rural areas. So you have two different directions, and where do you think that we will ultimately go? I mean, I don't consider Osaka to be a very rural
It's a great question. We were talking about this earlier, and this is something that's way above my pay grade, but it's something that the Japanese government's going to have to balance. Basically, you could say requests from these gaming operators who would love to be near the Imperial Palace. If not, there's a big piece of land right there. I'm just joking. Please don't quote me on that. But and obviously Osaka is an area where there are some plots of land there that are highly desired, that are owned by the Osaka government, but there are also 3 licenses. So people have been saying, well, 1 will go to a metro area and 2 will go to a rural area. And those rural areas, in reality, when you think about them, there are only a few places that they could actually put them near an international airport, near, you could say, within a reasonable distance from, you could say, the transportation hubs and whatnot.
Such as Wakayama, for instance, or Okinawa?
I mean, Japan has a lot of, you could say, yeah. But I think the Okinawa government expressed some dissatisfaction with that idea. But I mean, there's probably 7 or 8 you could pick from. I have no inside information on which ones might be selected. But
thank you. Next question. Again, there is a big difference between what the Japanese government says and what obviously the operators would wish. Abe-san talks mostly about the foreign tourists who are coming from all over the world to all spend their money in Japan. And the reality is much more like, from the operator's point of view, yes, we want to be close to Tokyo or so, where there are a lot of Japanese who can lose their money there. So How do you go? How are you going to consolidate that point?
Right. Look, I think
Or
it's
what is the ratio between foreign tourists and Japanese people?
Sure.
Visiting
Japan
the,
does not need to put integrated resorts to draw tourists, right? I mean, Japan is an amazing tourism destination on its own. What the idea is that for the tourists that are already coming, which there are many, you would say that this would be discretionary spending, so that those tourists, and it's also having a tourism product that is competitive with other locations in Asia. So from that standpoint, you wouldn't necessarily think about it in terms of just Japanese people gambling. You think about it as a diversified product that will cater to international travelers who, on average, would have a higher discretionary spending when they're on vacation, when they're taking international flights. So on average, we would say that customer should have a greater propensity to be able to be a good gaming customer than your average Japanese person walking the street.
Okay. You haven't given me any ratio. How many Japanese?
Well, I
how
mean,
many
the
percent?
ratios are hard to describe because you would say they're 7 years in the future.
Okay.
Right, so I mean, everything. If I could predict that, then I'd be doing another business.
Yeah, but you have to make a prediction for several $1 billion anyhow. No?
Yeah, you generally, though, I mean, in Macau, you would say that 90% of the customers, gaming customers, are some form of Chinese.
Yeah,
So
okay.
they could be mainland Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, Malaysian Chinese. So that generally is the customer demographic.
Okay.
There's very few Japanese that are actually gaming customers in Tokyo, so you would expect that you would have some high net worth Japanese customers, and you would have a large contingent of Chinese customers. I would imagine that if it could be 50-50, I think everyone would be pleased.
Okay. Yeah, I would be very pleased at 50.
So
Because
just before you ask your last, could I just check if there are any other questions? You've had a good run, but can we come back to your question after we've had a couple of other questions
Sure,
from the
by all means.
good man. All right.
Lisa.
Thank you.
Yeah, you do.
Hi, thanks for your time today. I'm Lisa Du with Bloomberg News. Two questions. My first question is about if the bill is passed. If it passes, what will kind of be, you think, the most immediate change in how companies, that's both Western operators and Japanese companies, how they act or, and what they do as they go about trying to win one of these casino licenses? And then the second question I have is I think there's general consensus now is that the casinos will be run, the IRs will be run by a consortium of companies. What do you imagine the winning consortium to look like? Will it be majority Japanese or Japan company led, or will it be more Western, a foreign operator focused and led?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for your question. Let me take the second one first. You could say in a country with a challenging, with challenging growth potentials, with decreasing birth rates and with the government making a concerted effort to generate new business, I couldn't imagine that the government would give away one of these, you could say, a very attractive industry to non-Japanese companies. And so, and I've alluded to this a little bit, but right now the law is not passed. So and there is, you could say, a stigma about gaming and gambling just because of the nature of that business. But once it becomes the law of the land in Japan, a lot of these big companies, these blue chip type of real estate or trading companies, now that it's legal, it wouldn't be seen actually to have an approved department. A lot of these companies right now, they don't have any approved IR departments because the IR is not a legal business in Japan right now. But once it becomes, you'll see departments becoming formed, part of their real estate departments, and you could say that a lot of companies will start looking at the IR business much more holistically. Who's going to control the retail? Who's going to control the hotel? Who's going to be the landlord? And you'll see these various trading companies come together, I would say, or Kiretsu or Zaibatsu, for lack of a better word, come together and I think put together what they see as a consortium that's designed to take advantage of these kind of high-value customers and carve out you could carve out their expertise in how they operate these businesses. I think that's the second one. So how the consortium looks to me is that it's primarily a Japanese-led enterprise which deals with non-gaming businesses, but which deals with land, which deals with construction, which deals with hotel operations, with retail, with luxury retail sales, with maybe some amusement park offerings, and then maybe a foreign casino operator will come in as a minority partner, as a minority equity investor, and will participate in some capacity. So it's very much a Japanese-led enterprise, and it also will function better because that enterprise will be responsible for dealing with the relevant Japanese authorities. You could say that consortium will entirely be responsible for that. The first thing is the most immediate, impact after the laws passed. You will start to see a lot of just capital being liberalized. Just now that it's a new industry, like any new industries, people start making investments, and you could say R&D or in consulting, or you'll start seeing there'll be a lot of work for professional services firms, which will be great for a lot of those guys who've been working a long time in this industry. So, my sense is that you have 7 years. You have 7 years to put all these things together. You take a look at in Macau, just from under Phase 2, in the last 5 years, there's been close to $15 billion of capital investment into Parisian and Wynn Palace and MGM Cotai and Macau Studio City. So all of that a lot of that came from equity, but a lot of that came from bank lending. So the banks will have to get on board with their loan departments and how they're going to evaluate casino gaming, what their rules for gaming and non-gaming lending is going to be. So all those things need to be sorted out. But that creates jobs, it creates activity, it creates conversation. More people come to Japan. It's all good.
Michael Penn of the Shingetsu News Agency and Asia Gaming Brief. Two of the criticisms made by the people who are against it but have economic criticisms are as follows. I want to get your reaction to them. The first one you sort of already addressed, that people coming to Japan, tourists coming to Japan, aren't really going to be drawn by casino gambling and integrated resorts. People are coming to Japan in droves already for the Japanese experience, the culture, that even though the government is promoting this very much as something which is going to drive the tourist industry, they say, no, it's not. It's not going to draw very many tourists here. It's really not going to work that way. Japan's doing fine on tourism, is going to continue to do fine. The second one was an economist who basically argued that it's not really going to create new wealth. These integrated resorts are simply going to cannibalize other parts of the economy. So for example, the example he gave was that people looking for nightlife in Osaka will now go to Umeshima, but they won't go to Umeda or Namba. And essentially it's just moving the wealth from one hand to the other hand, but it's not really creating a whole lot of new industry and new wealth. Your reaction to these two things?
I disagree with the latter. That's not really been proven. You can look at just the GDP of any. I mean, Macau is maybe a bad example where 80% of the GDP is from gaming. So, and then Singapore, you've got close to $8 billion worth of new revenue there. That's a lot of it is driven by overseas players, Malaysian, Indonesian, mainland Chinese, and so keep in mind that the products that the casino operators are envisaging are high-end products. They're designed for customers with a lot of disposable income. So what we're talking about here is well beyond the level of spending some money in some bar or just some regular nightlife. These are players. These are customers that have that when they play, they're well and above. Their budgets are well and above that. So and the first question is, look, Japan's design has put in these laws. primarily so that the casinos have to go after these foreign players. So I generally think that these are good laws that the Japanese lawmakers have thought about, they've considered, and they should provide enough deterrent, or you could say, or limitation for those people that you could say may have issues for responsible gaming. Does that answer your question?
Well, will it drive tourism, though?
I don't necessarily think that the casinos drive tourism. For Japan, for Macau, they certainly do. For Singapore, I think you could say that it's driven people to those locations. But Singapore is primarily its geography is small compared to somewhere like Japan. But it will drive tourism to those specific locations, and so I think in that regard, regional tourism will be driven. Yes.
You mentioned that. So just on going back to Lisa's question about the behaviour of the big foreign operators and whether that would change. I mean, given what you've said about the position that they might end up playing as minority holders in these, I mean, do you think that those that have been following this have listened as a succession of these foreign operators have promised $10 billion essentially, or as much as it takes, whatever the language has been. Do you think that they have misplayed that? Do you think that was in fact not the right thing to be saying, or do you think that they suddenly stop saying that now and start saying, well, actually we're happy to be part of it?
Right. As the laws get developed, more information is released, and as it gets meted out in the press, and it becomes more modelable, you could say, like I've done with looking at these resorts. So if you had a completely, you could say, laissez-faire casino customer base with no restrictions, you could definitely invest $10 billion. When you start restricting the local population, then you need to let's say, take into account the fact that my local population is limited, and I'm going to restrict the amount of people that can actually come into the casino. You start making, I would say, qualifications on the amount of your respective investment. But by and large, it may not be 10 billion, it may not be 5 billion, but be more than 2 billion or 3 billion. It'll certainly be the most challenging integrated resort product that's ever been designed anywhere. One with the integration with the infrastructure and transportation hubs, the architecture, the impact with earthquakes and typhoons. And then just the Japanese kind of penchant for over kind of construction, right? Just the overbuilding of these things. It'll certainly add a significant amount of cost to what are already pretty expensive products. And that's why, to answer your $10 billion question, nobody has $10 billion. I mean, no casino operator has $10 billion. They may have $3 billion and they got to go borrow $7 billion, but they don't have $10 billion. So that $10 billion was predicated on the fact that the Japanese lending market would be available to them. And I don't know any Japanese bank's going to loan $7 billion now without it being underwritten by a gigantic Japanese company. And so that's why this consortium element is so important, because in order to make a decent return, you have to have a little bit of leverage on these projects.
And just on, so I really take the point about the change that comes when you've got a law in place and the companies can internally justify having something that was previously not legislated for. But even so, I mean, do you not anticipate a continuation, let's say, of the taboo? The casino taboo. I mean, to an extent. I mean, for example, when you're postulating these very large Japanese companies, do you think it's the case? Because I've heard this theory that somebody like Mitsui or Mitsubishi Estate are not going to decide that they want their reputation in any way associated with the casino, no matter how obvious they would be as developers, and that it'll end up being with a sort of second or third tier development, still very large companies. But do you think that's still going to exist? That actually there's going to be a kind of top tier company of blue chip that doesn't get involved?
That's definitely problematic, because you need to access those, you could say, associated banks. And if those big companies aren't interested, the associated banks may also not be interested. And if those associated banks are not interested, you've got a real challenging market for the development of these integrated resorts. And then if then you got to maybe, let's say, get U.S. banks involved. And I mean, I can't see a situation where the Japanese banks won't lend to Japanese companies. And what's happened in Macau, which is very interesting because that has happened, is that you could say very big Chinese banks, when they loan to integrated resorts, they carve out their loans only for the non-gaming portions of the edifice, and that the equity is only to build the casino portion. And so keep in mind that they'll actually they actually have a first claim on all the cash flows that are generated even from the casino. But it's how they kind of cover their tracks by only loaning to non-gaming, so hotel, retail, other building, physical structure, but not to any casino elements. So there are ways around that, but it would be difficult if someone made a decision that they just don't want to participate.
Is that it? Any questions, everyone? Very good. Everyone's run out of things to ask you.
Okay.
You've covered it so fully. So I'm going to give everyone a last chance.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
I didn't see your hand before. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Takahashi. I'm with Bloomberg News. And thank you for your presentation. I'd like to ask you two questions. One is related to your timeline and milestone on page 11. Can you clarify which one is based on your calculation and which one is already set, like written by a government document or something?
Right. These are basically the timelines that we've actually received from our, you could say, very knowledgeable consultants.
Okay. And is there any factors that can delay or speed up those timelines?
I mean, this is, you could say that in any of these things that everyone's going to have an opinion. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, it would be hard to imagine it going faster than this. We've given kind of 1 year as really, I mean, everything needs to really be debated and decided. So if you look at the timeline and say, you could pick any of those and maybe have a different opinion on the timing of it on your own and adjust it. But even like the most important one, which is break ground and grand opening, 3 years would also be very aggressive. Mm-hmm. That'd be a very quick timeline to take an integrated resort.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, so after the bill is passed, every city is going to choose foreign operator to tie up with consortium?
That's a good question because there are more operators than there are cities. Mm-hmm. So I can tell you that operators that I know would like to, get exclusives with certain cities. Mm-hmm. And so then there's going to be some trading between that city and that prefecture mm-hmm. and that city and how that gets decided. So mm-hmm. if I'm one city with two different operators, mm-hmm. If I'm an operator, I want exclusivity. So if I don't get an exclusivity, I'd probably go to a different city, is mm-hmm. how I would look at it. Okay.
Do you have any guess on which cities might going to tie up with which company?
No, I do not have any. I can tell you that the biggest companies would want the biggest cities.
Okay.
And so and the smaller companies need to be realistic, and they'd probably choose areas that are areas where they feel they can make a bigger impact.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I did, and you shall have it now. Yes.
Yeah, I take it that you have read this morning's Japan Times.
Depends what article.
Well, there is a one-page article about the IR resorts. This morning.
Please.
No, you didn't.
I
okay.
didn't.
No.
Okay.
But one of the key questions, which is particularly raised by the opposition parties, is of course the danger of addiction.
Great question. I was waiting for someone to ask me about that.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
Just let me finish the question. It is a fact that Japan, I think it's now 3.6% of the population.
I did read that actually, yes.
Oh, you read that
yes.
too? Okay, yeah. So
I feign
yes,
ignorance.
game addiction, I think, is what most of the people are very afraid of.
Okay.
And thank you for your presentation in any case.
You're welcome. No, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions. I appreciate that. So this is actually a really good question, and there's we could actually spend the next 10 minutes on it, but I'll try and make it as concise as possible. So responsible gaming, every jurisdiction in the world has different levels of, you could say, responsible gaming. So if you go to a casino and there are limitations that, let's say, certain government regulation or government regulators would put in. So in Macau, for instance, they've limited how much money you can take out of the ATM. Okay, so that's one way to limit how much, you can't go out and pull out 5,000 US dollars. You could before, but now you can't. Other things is that I could go to a gaming regulator and I could actually self-ban myself, so that the gaming regulator will tell all the casinos, this person has basically requested that they ban themselves, kind of a self-selection process. That gets transmitted actually to all the security departments, and there's facial recognition, so that if you try and go in, they will actually come and they will ask you to leave, all right? There's also, you could say, undesirables, that the casino knows that these are people who are just either encouraging non-responsible habits. You could say like loan sharks or other types of illicit businesses, where the gaming companies are very good in addressing that these are not the people we want in the casino. Now, when we talk about responsible gaming, gaming by and large is addictive product. It's similar to tobacco or alcohol. And so therefore, a lot of steps need to be taken in order to make sure that your customers are the responsible customers. Now, the Japanese government is good because they've already put in place some regulations, right, to be able to kind of restrict on, to kind of address this, you could say, right? Whether or not it restricts it, I don't know whether you can get around it, remains to be seen. But we have this technology now. 7 years later, the technology will develop, and now it's going to be associated with a My Number card. So there will be a number of other, you could say, activities or methods that the gaming regulator will be able to adopt in order to, let's say, prevent this kind of this problem gambling. Furthermore, we've addressed everyone addressed the demand side, right, the customer side, but the gaming regulator can also address the supply side, which is, if I call you every day and I say, please come to my casino, I'll give you a free room, please come, I'll give you, some a free food and beverage, you're going to be more likely to come than not come. So the gaming regulator can also control the marketing that the gaming operators do. And it's something that is not widely reported, but every promotion that goes out in various gaming jurisdictions usually need to be approved by the regulator. When you have marketing departments with thousands of people calling tens of thousands of people every day, come back, then you have responsible gaming on the other hand, which is like, okay, we're bringing all these people, then you have responsible gaming products. You can also address the supply side. You can also limit how much the casino marketing can call you. You can also limit how much promotions that you can offer. So all those things taken into consideration, and the gaming regulator has not yet been formed yet. But once it's formed, they'll come up to speed. They'll be made aware of what they can do, what they can't do. They can always change. If they find something's not working, they can change. They can adopt. So in the end, it should be enough, I would say, to kind of prohibit or to at least address this idea of problem gambling. And so, I mean, whether or not the political party, finds this enough to kind of mollify its concerns is one thing. But I'm just telling you, from an operational and practical perspective, a lot can be done on the supply side as well to further reduce problem gambling.
Oh, sorry. Before, there's a question about that first. Thank you.
I'm Aaron Lin from Taiwan China Times. I think you yourself have said once that myopic restrictions on or attempts to restrict irresponsible gaming could be counterproductive. But then you just explained about how there's these already set into place restrictions like self-banning. I'm wondering if your perspective has either changed, or would you mind elaborating more on the counterproductiveness of these restrictions?
Thanks, Aaron. You read some of my previous pieces. Thanks for that. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a laissez-faire capitalist, so I believe in usually less restrictions better. I kind of look at it from an investment criteria perspective. If I'm an investor, I want to be able to generate as much revenue as possible and as much cash flow in order to repay my investment. Those articles I wrote were, you could say, before all of the law had been kind of decided. And I wrote those looking at Macau and looking at how they almost had kind of a Wild West form of gaming. Anything went, and you saw gaming revenue skyrocketed. Various relevant Macau regulators and government officials thought this is a bit too much, and they put in, you could say laws and regulations that calmed it down a bit. And so, I mean, in the end, these are things that are good for society, good for the population, which I'm not against. What I was talking about was purely from an economic perspective and purely from a return on investment perspective.
My second question just comes purely from my curiosity, from my sophomoric understanding of international relations. You said that some of this may affect the relations with China. I'm wondering how this appeasement, or like an attempt to appease relations with China, will fit in the overall context of the bid for casino licenses.
So when I said thanks for your questions. When I said good relations between China and Japan, you can look at an example like South Korea, where South Korea got these Patriot missiles, and then China just stopped the tourism into South Korea. So what all we're saying is that if your business plan is based on, we're not having that many Japanese because they've already said that we put these my number regulations and there's a limitation on Japanese attendance, and then you're saying, okay, that's okay because Chinese visitation and tourism is going to increase. You just hope that Japan and China have a good future relations and nothing impacts your primary customer base, at least from a spending perspective, because if it does, you're going to have problems. That's my contention.
So do you still have a question?
And then one more after.
Oh, yes, Harry goes ahead.
Yeah, one more after.
One additional question was spurred by your answer to Kurt's question about the operators themselves and restrictions on advertising and things like this. One of the most controversial elements from the opposition's point of view is Article 85 of the IR bill, which says that the operators will be allowed to loan money to their own customers, their own casino customers. This is something that, according to the opposition, they think it's going to be actually promoting more kinds of debt and problem gambling sites, and they don't see why the operators should be given a different set of rules, which is more restrictive than other kinds of loaning of money. So, what's your view of this? Is this a problem? Why are operators being allowed to loan money to their own customers?
Thanks. That's a good question. I actually wrote an article about this specific point. If you're interested, I can forward to you. But
I would.
So this is, I used to work in the casino finance department in the Venetian, so this is quite interesting. But as an operator, when you loan money to a customer, you're giving them money. One is based on, all these are, you could say, preferred programs where that player is generating commission for themselves to play in the casino. So one is that you usually require a deposit to loan them, and you loan them, let's say 50-50 or something along those lines. Number two is that as a big, you could say, New York Stock Exchange listed company, all we're going to do if that customer loses and doesn't pay back is we're going to actually sue that customer. We're not going to employ any other means of collection. And why I think that's important is because if that customer was not allowed to borrow, let's say, chips, and it's quite a standard thing that a customer will be able to come in and get a marker, and we know who he is, and it's all quite on the up and up. But if let's say that service wasn't allowed, they'd be forced to go to other places, and those places could be high interest consumer finance companies, which in my opinion is probably not as good of an option as just borrowing directly from the casino, who are established and where you have a direct relationship rather than bringing in a third party relationship.
So customers should be borrowing to play?
Not that they should. It's not that they should be borrowing. It's just that credit is the primary means of VIP play. There's there's a restriction on capital outflows from China. So when Chinese customers come in, you need to make a determination on whether or not you're gonna allow them to play, and sooner or later they're gonna pay you back if they lose. Sorry, I think we have one back here.
Sorry, it's just a request to show the slide on the restriction.
Oh, restriction. Oh, okay.
Yeah, please. Go.
Haruko Watanabe, HKW.
Hi.
You spoke this IRS and casino business, very cool business manners. But for Japanese, gambling has some kind of sentimental or charity or welfare-based some kind of sentiment behind it. Do you think those operating companies should provide certain percentage of their surplus or income for charity basis or welfare basis, or if they pay their tax and that's it?
So thank you for your question. In Macau, actually, where it's close to a 40% tax, 35% will go to the government, and then the additional 4 goes to various social programs. So when you look at 40 billion and 4%, that's $1.6 billion. That's going to a number of different charitable organizations. But yeah, I definitely do think that I didn't have it actually in this slide. I should have put it in here. But integrated resort has a responsibility to the entire community, and these integrated resorts are going to be going into potentially rural locations, which means that they have a greater responsibility than just making money for their shareholders. There's a social welfare component, which means that you have to be a good corporate citizen. You have to integrate with a local government. And you have to provide. You're going to have big buildings there. They're going to be able to, in the event of natural disasters, provide facilities where that they can kind of house a local population and house in terms of natural disasters. I know in Macau we have typhoons there all the time. A lot of the areas were made available for the customers to seek refuge. Even non-gaming customers, even just people off the street. When there was a typhoon, the St. Regis opened its doors and brought in a number of people so they wouldn't get blown away. I have pictures I can show you. So I was there. So in any event, I certainly believe that. How that gets figured out is going to be a determination between various associations, various governmental authorities, and then those respective operators themselves. But there definitely should be a requirement for that.
I'm afraid I think that's going to have been the last question, but I think everyone here will join me in thanking David Bonnet very, very much indeed for the time he's given us today and for the insight that he has provided. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. The final tradition is to this membership for a year in token of our thanks and the hope that you will come and visit us as regularly as you like, with or without a integrated resort.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Yeah, thank you.